Welcome. How wonderful to see so many of you who have come to hear the brilliant Alan Dershowitz.
Thank you.
I promise you two things. Number one, we'll have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A, just a very little bit, but we will have it. So if someone is burning with a question, make sure you get that hand up. And the second thing is that I also promise that although we will not begin in this space, that I promise you Alan will tell you some tales of trial. I want to begin, first of all, by telling you how I know Alan, which he doesn't even know. And then I want to talk about a topic that is dear to my heart that he's written about. I only brought one book that I purchased yesterday because this was Alan's 50th book. 50th. And now there is a 51st Alan has. It just came out. There are 5 books for sale in the bookstore. They are really extraordinary. Alan, when I was practicing law in Boston, before I went into television about the law, Alan had a house in Cape Cod in a town called Truro, and he has shared that house with a man named Jim Hamilton.
That's right.
And I had heard of Alan Dershowitz as, I think, forever, but certainly as long as I had been interested in the law. And I rented that summer house from Jim Hamilton for a few weeks. And that's how I know Alan, which he may not even know. So what I wanted to start with is, this is The Price of Principle. And a book that is very close to The Price of Principle is another book called The Case Against the New Censorship. And they tie in together because you are known as one of the most principled people, let alone advocates, in the country. And as a result of your living by principle, you wound up being a victim of cancel culture.
Right.
In the most recent times, you became a victim of cancel culture because you dared to represent Donald Trump. And your liberal friends, or so-called friends, decided that they didn't want you around anymore. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you first, how did you come to represent him?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been an incredible conference. I think there's never been so many great writers united in one place since Thomas Jefferson sat alone in his study. The story of my representation of Trump is really quite interesting. In the summer of 2016, let's remember, Hillary Clinton's way ahead in the polls. I write to my publisher and I say, they're trying to impeach Hillary Clinton before she even gets into office. There were all kinds of Republicans moving in that direction. One of them said, on the day of inauguration, we'll impeach her. I said, let me write a book called The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton. And he said, yes, and they actually produced a cover. Well, something happened on the way to the forum, and the wrong person got elected. I voted very much against him, voted for Hillary Clinton, campaigned for her, contributed to her, and then, of course, the Democrats impeached Trump. And I had done all the research already. And, and the research had persuaded me that the framers of the Constitution, I read every word of the Constitutional Conventions and every word of the state constitutional conventions, that they would only allow impeachment if a president had engaged in treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And by other high crimes and misdemeanors, they meant criminal-type activity akin to treason and bribery. That's not what they impeached Trump on. They might have, and if they had, I wouldn't have defended him, but they impeached him on the ground of obstruction of Congress and abuse of power. Now, those are vague terms that could be applied to almost every president, and it worried me greatly that it doesn't pass the shoe on the other foot test, that if the Democrats start doing that and the Republicans start doing that, Alexander Hamilton's greatest fear in the Federalist Papers was that impeachment would be used based on who had more votes in the Congress. So I decided, over the strong objection of my wonderful wife, who's sitting here today and still hasn't forgiven me for that, and many members of my family, that my principles, the same principles that had me defend Bill Clinton when he was impeached, the same principles that had me defend Ted Kennedy when he had his problems in Chappaquiddick, the same principles that led me to defend Natan Sharansky, who was in prison in the Soviet Union, Václav Havel, who had been imprisoned in the former Czechoslovakia, Nelson Mandela. I had represented all of those people, and I couldn't say no to Donald Trump. I never mentioned the name Donald Trump in my 68-minute argument in the Senate. I talked about defending the presidency and the Constitution, and I did it purely on principle, and now nobody in the town of Chilmark and Martha's Vineyard is willing to talk to me. Larry David came over to me and said, "You're despicable, you're a disgrace." I hate to say this because there are Kennedys here. Caroline Kennedy was seated next to me, who I like and I always admired, at a dinner party, and she said to me, "If I knew you had been invited, I wouldn't have come." She's now the ambassador, supposed to talk to people in China, and she wouldn't talk to me because of who I represented. And so my wife and I have a thick skin. She has been the victim. My children have been the victim. My grandchildren have been the victim. But my intention is to fight back. The library in Chilmark, the public library in Chilmark, banned me from speaking and banned my books. This is a writers' conference. And it's amazing how liberals, people on the left, can become McCarthyites. And the reason is obvious. They honestly believe, and they may be right, that Trump is extraordinarily dangerous for America, and that I was a facilitator of Trump. But let's remember that who did John Adams think the most dangerous people in the world were in 1770? The British. And he defended the people accused of the Boston Massacre. And Thurgood Marshall defended murderers and rapists and you name it. And so, you know, I think the principle that everybody must get a zealous defense and the Constitution must always be defended has to come before my personal ease of life. It's been very difficult for us on Martha's Vineyard and other places. Thank God not here. People have been so nice here. But in places that ought to know better, cancel culture prevailed. Thank you.
I want to read you one paragraph from this book. I love this book, The Price of Principle. The price of principle is high. I am paying the price. I ask no one to feel sorry for me. I chose my way of life. But the punishments for principle and the rewards for unprincipled partisanship transcend me and my family. They reflect a corrosive societal trend that endangers the cohesion of our nation under the rule of law. I will continue to fight for principle, no matter how high the personal price. I salute you.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You've paid that price in various ways before.
Yeah.
You've represented some very unpopular people.
Deservedly so. Deservedly unpopular people.
When I look at you as a lawyer, I look at you as a purist. I think that anyone can come into your office, explain their charges against them or that they anticipate may be leveled against them. And my thought is, right or wrong, that if you have the time and the case interests you, that you will take that case.
Right.
I envy you that because I don't think when I practiced that I was as pure as you. And I think that what makes the system work is it's an adversarial system, that you must have people who ethically and properly prosecute and defend. And if one of those goes away, we don't live in the United States of America. So when you look back at your career, besides Donald Trump, who do you think of your clients really became a difficult person in the public eye for you to represent, or after you represented?
Well, first, you were a phenomenally good lawyer in Boston. You were the queen of the criminal defense bar, and for good reasons.
I just got taller.
You got people acquitted who, if I were a judge, I would have wanted a sentence for 30 and 40 years in prison. If I were a judge, I'd be the toughest judge in the world, because that's a different role. If I were a prosecutor, I'd be a tough prosecutor. Defense attorney's job is very different. I started my career, I never practiced law. I became an assistant professor at Harvard at 25 and a full professor at 28. And I had no experience. When my first case came along, it was a neighbor in Brooklyn who was accused of capital murder. He belonged to an organization called the Jewish Defense League, and they planted a bomb in the office of Saul Urach, who was bringing Soviet talent over, and these were Jews who didn't want to see Soviet talent. And the young woman, whose brother-in-law happened to be a billionaire who contributed buildings to Harvard and who threatened to stop giving to Harvard unless I was fired. So in any event, she was killed, and the neighbor couldn't get a lawyer. And so the neighbor's father said, well, if we can't get a real lawyer, why don't we go to Dershowitz? He's a professor. Maybe he can help. And so I turned to my former student, Harvey Silverglade, and I said, Harvey, can you show me how to get to the courthouse? And together we worked and we obtained acquittals for all the defendants in my first extraordinarily controversial case, and particularly the Jewish community who hated the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, Meir Kahane, and the radicals. My mother didn't talk to me for a while as a result of that case. And that's how it really started. That was a pro bono case, my first case. I would say 60% of my cases over my lifetime and causes have been pro bono. I never, when the students, I used to have students who would evaluate the 1,000 letters I get every year asking me to defend them, I would say the one thing I don't want to know is whether they're paying clients or not paying clients. I want to make the decision based on the merits and the constitutionality of the case. Now, when the name is Leona Helmsley, you know it's not in forma pauperis, and so you know something. But when the name is John Smith, you don't know. And my rule has always been, because I had tenure at Harvard, and because I have no excuse for not defending people, I didn't have to make a living. I was making a good living as a professor. I couldn't be fired. My first criteria was take on the most controversial cases that nobody else will take on. And that's why I was called the lawyer of last resort. In fact, when an Israeli newspaper interpreted lawyer of last resort, this was the time I was representing Leona Helmsley and her hotels, they interpreted it as Dershowitz was the last lawyer for resorts. Not quite what I had in mind. And so if nobody else will take the case, and I think the primary examples are people like, obviously, Jeffrey Epstein, one of the most despicable characters in American history. And of course, I didn't know anything about that. I was introduced to him by Lady Rothschild, and the president of Harvard told me to become acquainted with him and go to his seminars because he was contributing all this money. None of us knew anything about it. He met the Queen, and the Queen had conversations with him, and he met me and my wife, and then I represented him, and I got a deal. He almost fired me and refused to pay the fee because he said the deal was terrible. Everybody else said the deal was too good, and nobody's ever happy with that kind of thing. But I've represented some of the most popular people in the world. Look, who could have more pride than representing Nelson Mandela? And I'll tell you the story about my representation of Nelson Mandela.
Please.
So my job was to try to get a spy swap involving Nelson Mandela, Anatoly Sharansky, who was then serving his 8th year in a Soviet prison for nothing, fact, for nothing, I'll tell you the story. I learned all these stories representing Soviet dissidents. So a new guy comes to the Gulag, and he got 10 years in prison, and all the prisoners yell at him, "What'd you do to get 10 years?" And he yelled, "I did nothing." They all yelled, "Liar, for nothing, they only give you 5 years." So, you know, I represented these folks, and the Mandela case, I spent Thanksgiving Day 1 year away from my family in East Germany and in other places, working with a guy named Wolfgang Vogel, who was the spy trader. If any of you saw The Bridge, about spy, he was the guy. So I dealt with him. And the goal was, the United States had arrested a East German spy. And I got a call from this guy, Vogel, and said it would be good if you could have somebody represent him who we can negotiate with. So I got Gene Baker and Harvey Silverglade to represent him.
Two
fabulous lawyers. And the goal was to get an exchange, Mandela and Sharansky, for this East German guy and another guy who was in a South African prison from the Soviet Union. And Mandela said no. I said, "We can get you out." And Mandela said, "No, I'm not a spy. I'm not a part of a trade. I am walking out only when both the segregationists and the apartheid government of South Africa lets me walk out. I'm walking out as a political prisoner, not as a spy," and he refused to be involved in the deal. We got Sharansky out. In fact, Sharansky's wife, when she called me, he had just been arrested. She was about 30 years old at the time, and she was crying on the phone, and she said, "I have only one wish. Get him out in time for him to give me a baby." And I got him out when she was 39. She had 2 children. I am essentially their godfather. And, you know, those kinds of cases give you tremendous pride. You sleep well at night. But when you represent people who you wish you were prosecuting, but that's not the job you were assigned, you have to do everything in your power, ethically, zealously, legally, to try to make the best defense. And sometimes when you win, you go home and you have that glass of scotch, and then you have that second glass and saying, "Why did I pick this profession? Why wasn't I a doctor?"
Well, I guess that brings me to the question. How did you feel when O.J. Simpson was acquitted?
Oh, I felt very good about that. I'll tell you why. And one of my heroes, Bill Bratton's in the audience, so he'll appreciate this. We didn't win the O.J. Simpson case. The police in Los Angeles lost that case. It was an open and shut case. You wouldn't need a prosecutor like Rikki Klieman to win that case. His blood is found at the scene. He has a motive. It's the easiest case in the world to win. And the idiot policeman, a guy named Officer Van Adder, decided the case may have been too weak because the glove had a lot of the evidence, and the glove was found illegally. What happened is the officer jumped over the fence, made up a phony story, said he was there to warn O.J. Simpson that maybe they were going to try to kill him. They found the glove. Everybody thought the glove would be suppressed. So what did they do? They manufactured a piece of evidence. What happened is O.J. Simpson was wearing socks at the time, and the socks were found on the foot of the bed in the search. And I actually saw the socks. I didn't see anything on them. And then they discovered that there was on the socks the blood of the victim and O.J. Simpson. Wow! What could be a better piece of evidence? Nothing, except we discovered that Van Adder had taken the sock home, unauthorized, and taken the blood vials home. And we were able to prove that he had poured the blood on the sock. How did we prove that? 2 ways. Number one, if you pour blood, if you are running through a crime scene and you have blood sprinkled on your sock, it's going to be on one side of the sock, and then there'll be a mirror image on the second side. There will not be a mirror image on the third and fourth side because the leg intervenes. This sock had 4 mirror images. And the jurors all believed us that they were framing a guilty person. The police knew, as far as they were concerned, he was guilty. They didn't want him to get away with it. And so they, quote, enhanced the evidence. And we proved that to the jury. And 9 of the jurors afterward who were interviewed essentially said that if we couldn't trust the sock, how can we trust everything else? Look, maybe the beating that occurred previously in Los Angeles had an impact, a racial impact. We don't know. I did not like the fact that Johnnie Cochran, who I loved, was a wonderful, wonderful lawyer. I did not like the fact that he played the race card. I called him on it. He was the chief counsel. I couldn't stop it. I don't think that was fair. And Bob Shapiro said he pulled the race card and he pulled it out of the bottom of his deck. So I don't want to be associated with that part of it, but it was exactly what we should have done. The police and prosecutors should not win a case with tampered evidence.
It's interesting. I wound up going into television because of that case.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
I was hired by Court TV specifically to anchor the O.J. Simpson case. And you, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld,
Yep.
who were the DNA guys,
Yep.
who we used to call fondly the science weenie guys.
Well,
We love them.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second. I got them on board. I brought them into the case. And F. Lee Bailey tried to keep them out of the case, saying they're too New York. But Barry did a phenomenal
They were really
job.
phenomenal. And so what you're saying, in essence, is looking at the evidence on the sock,
Yeah.
let alone the glove, which, of course, had shrunk because it had been wet. And if it couldn't fit on your hands or Johnnie Cochran's hands, it certainly could have never fit on O.J. Simpson's big hands.
Yeah.
That science really won that case.
Look, my specialty has been over the 50 years, now it's almost 60, that I've practiced criminal law, has always been science. I was hired at Harvard as the "and" professor. Every course I taught had an "and," law and psychiatry, law and DNA, law and literature. I actually taught a course called Law and Baseball. I'm going to ask you all a question, and then you can come over after and tell me. How do you get 4 outs in an inning? I'm not going to answer the question. You're going to lose sleep. How do you actually get 4 outs in an inning? I used to start my class on law and baseball by asking each of the students one of those questions. Then I realized they were not paying attention to the class. They were trying to figure it out. And so I ended my class with that instead of starting my class with that. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No. It's great to listen to your tales. Claus von Bülow.
Before we get to Claus von Bülow, I have one more story. Okay.
Please.
So Carolyn and I are in Israel. I was writing a book called The Genesis of Justice, about the book of Genesis. And we get a call from the then newly elected Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Oh, I have a question for you about that, too. Go ahead.
So who I had met when he was 22 years old and a student at MIT. And he said, Alan, bring your wife, bring your daughter to the equivalent of the Oval Office, and we'll schmooze a little, we'll talk a little, and we'll just say hello. So we go there. And then he says, Alan, I have a question I really needed to ask you. This is 1996. A question I really needed to ask you. So I thought it would be about Iran. I thought it would be about the Palestinians. Takes me into his little private office, which is absolutely soundproof. And he says, Alan, did O.J. do it? So I said, Mr. Prime Minister, does Israel have nuclear weapons? He said, you know I can't tell you that. I said, you know I can't tell you that.
I will get back to von Bülow, but you're mentioning Netanyahu and Israel brought you into the news recently.
Right.
There is a whole question. It goes back to principle. You're a staunch defender of Israel. And you have been very public about your support. And now there are actions occurring having to do with the legislature, for using a U.S. term, the legislature, and the judiciary that you do not approve of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Explain that.
And, it's a conflict. Carol and I were in Israel for 5 weeks a few weeks ago, and I met with the Prime Minister, I met with the President, met with everybody. And I had a very contentious talk with Bibi, who I've known, as I say now, for over a half a century. And I said, look, I support you on Iran. I support you on a lot of things. You're just wrong on the judiciary. The Supreme Court of Israel should have the last word on issues of civil rights, due process, free speech. There shouldn't be an override by the Knesset. And what's happening in Israel is exactly what's happening in the United States, a deeply divided country. In order for Bibi to become prime minister, he had to make deals with the devils. And I met the devils when I was there. Just like McCarthy, to become Speaker of the House, had to make deals with devils. I wish neither of them had done it. They did. They're both democracies, and the pendulum swings widely. Now, it's right in Israel, it's left in the United States. It'll change, but as long as both countries maintain their democratic character, I'm happy.
And you really believe that, and I share your belief, by the way, that the idea that a legislature can overrule the High Court, very dangerous.
It's very dangerous, and I told him that. And on Jake Tapper, just 2 nights ago, I didn't see it, but about 10 people told me, Jake Tapper interviewed on CNN Bibi, and one of his first questions was, even Alan Dershowitz, who's your friend and who defends Israel, is against this override. How do you defend it? So, I'm being used against the Israeli government, and I'm perfectly content with that. As you say, for me, it's a question of principle, and my principles always come before my personal friendships.
So now I'll get back to von Bülow.
Sure.
Very, very controversial figure.
Yeah.
People certainly believe that he did it.
Yeah.
Tell us about your relationship or your involvement in that case.
So I get a call on April 1st, and a guy with a British accent saying, "Hi, I'm Claus von Bülow." And I said, "An April Fool's Day to you, too. Who is this?" He said, "No, it's really Claus von Bülow, and I have a death penalty case." I said, "No, I read about it in the newspapers. It's 30 years. No, it's a death penalty case." He said, "In Britain, when you're convicted of 30 years and you're a gentleman, they give the gentleman an opportunity to go into a private room with a gun and resolve the matter in a way appropriate to him." I said, "You're using fancy words, but you're telling me if I don't win the case, you're going to commit suicide." He said, "Yes." And I don't know whether he was bluffing or not, but I decided to take the case. I put together an incredible team of students and faculty. Susan Estridge was part of my team. And, I'll tell you the great Susan Estridge story. So I finally get to argue the case. I was single at the time, although I was dating Carolyn. I was single at the time, and I had a big house, rented house in Cambridge, and everybody, the team played in the house, played basketball, and we worked on this brief together. So we argue the case, and I'm given a half an hour for my main argument and 10 minutes for rebuttal, and it's the first case on television, first live appeal ever on television. So people are watching it all over, and I do my first 15 minutes. I think I did a really good job. Who knows? I didn't know for sure. And then the state gets up and does its job, and I was happy, and I had 15 minutes. So I get up and I say, "May it, please the court." I had my 15 minutes of rebuttal, and rebuttal is always the most important part of the case. You get the last word. Suddenly, I feel a hand on my rear end, down my belt, like today it would be sexual harassment. It's Susan Estridge saying, "Sit the F down. You won the case. Shut up." And I listened to her, and I said, haltingly, with her hand still there, "Your Honors, if you have no further questions, I think I'll take my seat." And so they had no further questions, and just like 4 weeks later, they came down with their unanimous decision reversing, and then we went back for a new trial. And we had developed all this new evidence, all the evidence that it was an insulin, that, very scientific evidence, that, and in like an hour and a half of deliberations, the jury unanimously acquitted.
Science again.
Science again.
And I'm sure that you understand the hardest thing on earth for a trial lawyer and appellate lawyer is to sit down and be quiet.
Let me just tell you one more quick science story. So I represented a woman who was accused of killing her husband, you may know the husband by name, Banyan. He ran the casino in Nevada that had the World Series of Poker. And
Binion.
Huh? Binion. and he fell in lust with an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old stripper and married her. She, of course, had a boyfriend on the side. He was rich and old. And she ended up dead. He ended up dead. And the great pathologist
Michael
Baden was the lawyer, was the expert witness, and he proved miraculously, brilliantly, that they had burked him to death. Burking is a term coming from a Stevenson story called Burke and Hare, where they would kill people by compressing their chest and not allowing them to breathe. And he was able to prove it because he found a button mark on the skin, which was exactly the same as the button on his shirt that clearly demonstrated he died this way. I took over the case. I didn't do the trial. I took over the case. I look at the button mark, and I'm having my doubts. The body is, of course, no longer around. It's just photographs. I take the photograph to Dr. Nims, who is the head of pathology at Mass General Hospital, and I say, I would like you to examine that mark. And I showed him the photographs and everything, and he comes back with this amazing conclusion. No, it wasn't a bruise from a button. It was a pre-existing birthmark. And he did that through the venal and everything. We then went back to pictures of him as a young man. Sure enough, there was the birthmark, and we won the case. So
it's a great postscript.
Yeah,
we did
yeah.
that trial on Court TV. I
Yeah,
loved
yeah.
that trial.
Yeah.
You have to understand the mentality of trial lawyers and appellate lawyers, where we love trials, that the general public would say, what's wrong with them? Look what happened to those people. Mike Tyson.
Mike was one of the nicest guys you'll ever want to meet. Gentle, soft-spoken. He invites me to come and meet him and Don King in the hotel room the night before he was about to go to prison. Would I do the appeal? And he was kind of giving me, I was interviewing for the appeal. And he gives me the facts, his version of the facts. And, we went to a hotel room with a young woman who we had met, and 3 a.m, and they had sex. He said consensual. She said no. And he gives me the story, and he says, so Alan, you think I'm innocent or guilty? And I said, Mike, I can't tell that. I mean, I have to read the whole record. I have to read the transcript. I can only tell you I'll give you the best possible defense I can. I said, all right, enough of that lawyer's talk. What about me? What kind of a person do you think I am? I said, Mike, you're asking me for a question. I'll give you the exact answer. You're a schmuck. He says, he stands up like that. I thought he was going to punch me. What do you mean, a schmuck? What are you calling me a schmuck? I said, you're a schmuck. I said, being one of the most famous men in the world, going to a hotel room at 3 o'clock in the morning without any witnesses, with somebody you didn't know, you're a schmuck. He turns to his people and he says, why didn't you tell me I was a schmuck? He's right. You're hired. And
I can't tell you how much I wanted to try that case.
Yeah, well, if you had, we would have won. He had a terrible trial lawyer. Don King hired a tax lawyer from Williams and Connolly to represent him. The guy hated Tyson so much, he wouldn't even sit next to him. He wouldn't be seen next to him. The jury saw that. And he had a terrible, terrible trial and a terrible trial lawyer.
McDonald.
I've had, 28 or 27 attempted murder, homicide cases. I've only lost a couple of them. And Jeffrey McDonald, I wasn't involved in the trial. I wasn't involved in the appeal. I was involved in the third.
Heartbreaking, right?
The third habeas corpus. And
it's heartbreaking.
But the guy may well be innocent. And there was somebody out there, a woman named Stokely, who fit the description. And it was terrible, and I had a really bad experience in the Fourth Circuit. I argued the case, and unsuccessfully, And the chief judge said to me, this is the third habeas that have been brought on this behalf. I'm telling you now, Mr. Dershowitz, do not bring another case in front of this court on habeas. I said, Your Honor, with all due respect, you have your job, I have my job. If the evidence warrants it, I will bring another case. And if you want to sanction me, that's your job. But please don't tell me how to do my job. And I did bring a fourth motion. We lost it again. He's still in jail. It's a tragedy. There are very few cases like that I've lost. I've had a really good record in homicide, particularly because they're science. All the cases are science. And if you want to be a lawyer, if any of you have children, grandchildren, want to be a lawyer, major in science. Learn about DNA. Learn about, you can learn about law in law school, but become an expert in the science. That's what wins and loses cases. Even in our post-fact world, juries listen to facts. And if you can give them the facts enough to cause a reasonable doubt, they will acquit.
Chicago 7.
Boy, that was tough. You remember the case? That was the 68 convention. Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, all of those guys. And I did the legal stuff in that case. And then I also represented Bill Kunstler, who had been held in contempt. That was a pro bono case. It was a very, very difficult case because the clients were impossible. Abby Hoffman, if the word schmuck appeared in the dictionary and there were two pictures, one would be Mike Tyson, the other would be Abby Hoffman.
Do you think there's a reason that you were involved with these people?
I don't know. In any event, it was difficult, but we prevailed, and I don't know whether we'd prevail today. Time matters. Timing is everything. I think I've won some cases based on science. Sometimes you win your cases based on the era, what the era is, and a good lawyer has to know that what worked in the past wouldn't work in the future. And look, today, let's turn to the elephant that's always in every room that I'm in, the false accusation against me that I had sex with a woman I never met, never heard of. That resulted from the Jeffrey Epstein case, and it was and I wrote a book about it. It's part of the whole Me Too movement. The book is called Guilt by Accusation, and it has on it, just recently reintroduced with her quote, I now recognize that I may have made a mistake in identifying Alan Dershowitz. Well, thank you, 8 years later.
And that was Virginia Giuffre is her name,
Yeah.
and that naming of Alan Dershowitz as someone who had assaulted her was horrendous for your whole life.
And my family, and my children, and my grandchildren. As part of the Me Too movement, my grandkids were in college at the time. And people were saying, oh, your grandpa's a rapist. Every single day to this day, I get emails, tweets, other kinds of messages. You're a pedophile, you're a child rapist, you're all of that. This is somebody I never met, never heard of. So this is a book. I don't stand by everything in this book because everything has changed now. Obviously, she's made her statement. We had depositions. I was deposed for 4 days. She was deposed. And, people have to judge for themselves about what the real facts are. But, I was canceled by the 92nd Street Y as a result of the accusation. I was canceled by Temple Emmanuel in New York, by the Ramaz School, and particularly the Jewish community. The leadership of the Jewish community treated me horrendously. Here I was, one of the most prominent spokesmen for Israel, speaking up on behalf of the Jewish community, but they became scared. As the head of the Temple Emmanuel said to me, Alan, I know you didn't do this. I know you had nothing to do with this, but we don't want trouble. And I said, that's what people said during the McCarthy period.
Exactly.
We don't want trouble.
Because you're dealing with the whole issue, which you bring up in both Price of Principle, but also in the case against the new censorship, is if people are silent, if people don't protest, if people don't speak their truth, then the result of that is being canceled, as you were in two instances. Virginia Giuffre, who was said to be sexually assaulted by Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and she named a number of other people who are very prominent, particularly in the political world, and Alan. And she was not going to let go of this accusation against Alan. And of course, she has named Prince Andrew. And she then to say, I may have made a mistake.
Well, the reason I was able to fight back, unlike some of the other people, I have never had sex or improperly touched a woman in my life since the day I met Carolyn, my wife. And so I had nothing to hide. I was perfectly willing to sit down to a deposition and say anything. Not everybody can do that, even if you're innocent of the crime. I don't want to get specifically into Prince Andrew, but his nickname was Randy Andy. Mine was not. And so the situation is very different. And so I thank you, Carolyn, for always standing by me and being my one and only. Yeah.
So sweet and true. We have exactly 3 minutes and 55 seconds left. So I promised you a little Q&A. If you have something, please raise your hand. Yes.
So much of your career has been looked at through the lens of current events and with the heat of emotion. I was curious to know what you desire for your legacy after time has worn away the heat.
Oh, that's a great
Wonderful question. I wish I thought of that.
I think Rikki gave me the legacy that I've always lived a life of principle, that I always tried to do the right thing, that I lived what my parents and family taught me. I grew up very poor in Brooklyn, went to a non-paying college. I worked my way up, and that I've tried never to deviate from my principles. Obviously, nobody can say they never have, but that would be my legacy principle.
Yes, anyone? Yes, sir.
How about, can you say a few words about trying cases before the Supreme Court?
Yeah. So it's my wife could probably testify to this better than I. One of my early cases in the Supreme Court, I defended pro bono 2 boys on death row who were totally innocent. Their father had committed this horrible, brutal murder of 5 people, 2 boys on death row, and I argued the case pro bono, and Scalia had just been put on the court. And Scalia loved questioning people and taking people on, and particularly other professors. Scalia was not a professor at Harvard, he was a professor at Chicago, and he had to prove he was smarter than me. And I, let him prove it. But Carolyn was sitting there shivering there, because 9 justices throwing questions at you, 1, 2, and they don't care about the answers. They're throwing the questions at you to make points with their other colleagues. So, arguing in front of the Supreme Court is daunting, difficult, and, nothing is more fun. I've argued free speech cases and the death penalty cases, and so it's been a thrill of my life to be able to help people. I've never lost anybody on death row. I did have a case, not a case, but like a day before he was to be executed, Carolyn came to me and said, please call Donald Trump and ask him to stay the execution of this man. This is a man who had engaged in a horrible murder when he was 18. He was now 40 and had rehabilitated. And I spent 20 minutes on the phone with Donald Trump trying to persuade him to spare him, and I failed. He said, look, I would have done it, but I've already told the parents of the victims, and they're on the way in the car, on the way to the execution, and I'm sorry, I just can't do it for you. And that's when I can't sleep at night. People ask me often, how do you sleep at night defending? That I sleep well, but when I fail in an effort to try to save somebody's life, it's the only time that ever happened. I wasn't his lawyer, I didn't know that much about the case, but I failed, and it just was devastating. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after that. All I was doing was dreaming about this young man whose life was taken from him, who could have spent his life helping other people and helping prisoners, and that's why I'm so strongly against the death penalty.
Well, I think you want to join me in thanking and really learning
Thank
the
you.
real Alan
Thank you.
Dershowitz.
Thank you.